My name's Rachel Richenberger. I am a current MSW student at Wichita State University, and just for reference, I am currently a practicum student placed in USD 259, which is the school district here in Wichita, Kansas.
And she is joined with Alyssa, who is another one of her classmates, also an MSW candidate. And I am doing my practicum working with child survivors of domestic violence.
So, pretty much today, we wanted to do this podcast to kind of share our experiences and our driving force in wanting to further engage in Aaron's Law and also the whole policy side of getting the bill passed in Kansas. But also, we're wanting to focus on what is our drive, what is our why of where we are at with this process.
When we first kind of started looking at bills, one thing that we knew we agreed on was we wanted to do something with kids in some capacity. And we ended up landing on kind of how child safety and education could mesh. I'm not obviously working within the school system, but I'm working with kids and they are going to school, so they're in the education system. So we saw a lot of different bills that were talking about the phone bill, which ended up getting passed, where they're going to take away phones during the school day. They had others regarding mental health and kind of how that intersected. But then we eventually landed on HB 2576, which looked at Aaron's Law and how that would require child sexual abuse education within school systems. And then we kind of just went from there and kind of dug right in and learned a couple things throughout the process.
So, House Bill 2576, which is also Aaron's Law, Kansas is one of 12 states that has not passed the bill yet. And it's important because yes, it goes into educating students on kind of being wary of being sexually exploited or experiencing sexual assault, but it also gives the school faculty members the tools and how to navigate those spaces, what signs might, show up and be red flags in regards to sexual abuse. But honestly, me personally, when I seen this bill, I was very intrigued and I felt very ambitious in like how can we get this passed in Kansas because I actually used to intern for ICTSOS. And this is our local anti-human trafficking nonprofit organization in Wichita. When I worked with them, I engaged a lot in preventative education regarding human trafficking and sexual assault. And the biggest gap that we saw was we weren't getting to kids young enough. We were speaking with, I think the youngest we went was seventh grade. And then we spoke with eighth grade and then ninth grade as well. But there's a need for that education and that safety training in younger age groups, but the organization that I worked with, we weren't allowed into elementary schools or we weren't allowed to speak with younger grades because there was such the idea of parents wanting to keep that language at home just because you don't know what's getting taught to the kids at school. So that was personally my driving force and why I was intrigued in continuing our advocacy efforts and how can we support this bill and how can we share information and get it, spread that awareness.
I like that you mentioned the timing of when we're actually getting to children. When I watched the hearing that happened over this bill, I can't remember off the top of my head who it was, but they were talking about how once a child is able to start toileting, they should be able to have a say in what is happening in the front and the back end of their bodies. And age appropriate education was a big piece of the bill. And I think that it might have scared people a little bit because of the unknown there. Like, people might not know what age appropriate looks like for, kindergarten versus someone who's in eighth grade. But it's a lot simpler than you would think.
Mhm.
It's like how you would talk about anything else. To a child versus someone that's older, you use child-friendly language, and this and that. So I like that you brought up that piece. As for kind of my driving force as to why I was satisfied when we ended up with working on this bill. Obviously, like I said, I'm working with child survivors of DV, and although that's not quite the same realm, it's similar. So I'm currently seeing how children who've been involved in DV situations are affected by that. Um, I haven't seen a lot of the kids like directly after it's happened, so direct effects, not so much, but um, I feel like there can be some overlap, but overall, I've just kind of seen how something very similar in some capacities is affecting them in their home life, how they interact with me, how they interact with peers, how school's going. You know, some of them are really struggling at school, um, and it's causing a lot of problems there. So that's kind of what kept me going and made me interested in this is because there's kind of an intersection between that and what I'm doing now and want children to be safe in all ways possible. And I definitely think that this bill is something that could do that.
I also agree with wanting, the whole goal here is to keep children safe. And in what capacities do we need to do that? I think it is very widely known that sexual assault, sexual abuse is one of the most underreported crimes, especially for kids. If you don't know something's wrong, if you don't know something's not appropriate, then it's normal. If, it's known that sexual abuse absolutely can happen in the household. And when you're a kid and you're experiencing it, who's telling you that it's not appropriate when it's a family member that's actually being the perpetrator, when it's the family member doing the abusing? And so, for our next episode, we're actually inviting Tess Ramirez, and she is one of the main driving forces. Well, she is the main driving forces. She's the one who proposed the bill for Kansas. And so on our next episode, we plan on inviting her and asking her a lot of questions and kind of getting down to the ins and outs of what did this process look like, and also how can we, as future social workers, as students, but also community members, how can we support the process of keeping Kansas children safe and encouraging the process.
Yeah, I think advocacy work can sometimes seem really intimidating. I know whenever we first started at the beginning, I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to do anything. I've always have kind of felt like, well, I'm just one person, so what can I really do? But then when you start doing, you're like, oh, okay, well, maybe my voice has a little bit more power than I thought. And there's a lot of things that are simpler than what I would have thought it could look like creating a fact sheet and handing that out to people. It's something that's relatively small in terms of, I guess, kind of effort to create.
Mm-hmm.
But the more that you can spread it out, the more that you are getting the word out there. And out of it can be a lot easier than you think it's going to be, and it's not as scary as what you might think.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with the fact navigating this space. I mean, I've personally learned that like advocating for policies and advocating for change, it's not always looking like going up to the Capitol and meeting with legislators. And as you said, it's as simple as you're speaking about it, you're sharing fact sheets, you're sharing information, you're getting people involved, you're finding different ways that could be considered more micro rather than macro. Um, so there's so many different ways that you can engage in advocacy efforts. And as you said, it's not as scary as one might think. It's just taking the first initial step to
Yeah.
actually get there. But I definitely think navigating this space has been a journey, and
Yeah.
it's been a learning curve for sure.
I think the other thing too that I want to touch on is the fact that there are allies everywhere you look. If you think of an issue that's happening in your community, you can 100% find someone somewhere that's already doing similar work. And for certain things, there's no point in just feeling like, okay, so there's this issue, now I have to completely start over. You don't. There are people who are doing the work. Partner with them, talk to them. You don't have to always reinvent the wheel, as people always say.
Shoot, what's that other work smarter, not harder? And speaking of advocacy allies, again, we are excited to invite Tess Ramirez, who she works with protecting, or she's one of the co-organizers of protecting Kansas children from sexual predators. So definitely stay tuned to hear more insight from Tess herself.